Even after years of tension, I still invited my daughter and son-in-law to Thanksgiving dinner at my home. In the middle of the evening, my daughter slid a document across the table, a notice to transfer ownership of the house and consent for me to enter a nursing home, and said, "This house will be mine sooner or later, Dad. Just sign it." I didn't argue. But when my lawyer walked in and placed a folder on the table, in that moment, the color drained completely from her face. Not a single drop of blood remained. "Welcome and thank you for being here. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. If you were handed that paper at your own dinner table, what would you do?" Please note, this is a fictional story, with meaningful, insightful elements for storytelling purposes. The silver edge of my carving knife was halfway through the turkey's breast when the doorbell rang. Not the rhythmic chime of a friend, but the sharp, insistent demand of someone who already thought they owned the place. I paused the steam from the bird rising to meet my face, carrying the scent of roasted sage and rosemary that Maria and I had perfected over 40 years of Thanksgivings. I am Silas Thorne, a 70-year-old retired aerospace engineer with silver hair and a back straightened by decades of precision work, and I have lived in this Portland craftsman home since the day the last nail was driven. I set the knife down with a slow, deliberate click against the platter. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, until the doorbell shrieked again. I wiped my hands on my apron and made my way to the front entryway. When I swung the door open, I expected to see my daughter and her husband perhaps a bit early, perhaps carrying a bottle of wine they'd picked up as an afterthought. Instead, I found a coordinated line of people that made my front porch feel like a stage set. My daughter, Emily Redmond, 38, stepped into the kitchen with the practiced smile of a pharmaceutical sales rep, her heels clicking too sharply against the hardwood I had refinished myself. Behind her stood Brian Redmond, a 41-year-old corporate recruitment consultant, in an expensive but slightly frayed wool coat, leaning against the doorframe with a passive-aggressive posture that signaled he was done asking nicely. But they weren't alone. Flanking them was a man in a charcoal suit holding a slim leather briefcase, and a woman with a fixed professional grin clutching a glossy brochure that screamed "Senior Living" in bold serif font. The knife slipped. A bead of grease hit the lace tablecloth like a bullet wound. I felt the air in the hallway instantly turn clinical and cold, as if the oxygen was being replaced by a sterile hospital-grade substitute. "Dad, we brought some people to help facilitate the transition," Emily said, her voice skipping over the word transition as if it were a minor speed bump. I stood there, my hands still gripping the heavy brass doorknob, and felt a tremor of confusion rising into a dull, thumping dread. I wasn't aware I was in transit. "Emily," I replied. My voice held the steady, unyielding tone of an engineer, a relic of my days on the hangar floor. But inside, I was reaching for a handhold that wasn't there. They moved past me without waiting for an answer. Brian didn't even look at me. He just steered the woman with the brochure toward the dining room. I followed them, a tight pressure building in my chest. I walked back into the room to find that Emily had already instructed Brian to set 4 extra places. The intimacy of my Thanksgiving, the one chair I'd left empty for Maria, and the quiet setting I'd prepared for my only child, was being erased before my eyes. The table now looked like a corporate board meeting. The woman from the facility began laying out her pamphlets right next to the cranberry sauce, the bright colors of the brochures clashing violently against the dark, honest wood of my table. "We have a lovely suite opening up in the West Hills facility next Monday, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice a choreographed melody of fake empathy. "It's a very popular floor plan." I looked at the glossy photos of beige walls and handrails. "My bedroom has been in this house for 42 years. I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I don't need a suite." "How do you tell your only child that her smile looks like a death warrant?" Emily didn't flinch. She just smoothed her skirt and looked at the man in the suit. The turkey sat at the center of the table, cooling and forgotten, a monument to a celebration that had been hijacked. The man in the suit, whom Brian introduced as their counsel, didn't touch the food. He reached into his briefcase and slid a document across the table. The paper was heavy and cold to the touch. Across the top, in stark, unforgiving letters, it read, "Quitclaim deed." The air in the room seemed to thin until I could hear the ringing in my own ears. Emily stopped pretending to be helpful. She dropped the facade of the concerned daughter, her eyes hardening into the gaze of a closer who was ready to sign the deal. "This is the only way to ensure the family legacy stays intact," Thorne Brian said, using my first name with a familiarity that felt like a slap. "You're 70. This house is too much for you. You can either make this a smooth transition or an expensive one. I stared at the paper, then up at my daughter. You're asking me to sign away my life before the gravy is even passed, I said. I felt the betrayal like a physical weight, a sickening slide in the pit of my stomach. You think you know betrayal until it sits down at your table and asks for the salt. The daughter I raised had vanished, leaving only a stranger with an emotionless gaze that this wasn't just a suggestion. It was a siege. Brian leaned forward, his eyes showing a flash of calculation that went far beyond mere family concern. He mentioned that they had already been in contact with a buyer for the house, someone who wanted to close by the end of the year, contingent on my voluntary relocation. My hand shook as I reached for the document, not because I was going to sign, but because I realized I was a prisoner in the house I had built with my own hands. Maria's eyes were fixed on me, from the silver frame on the sideboard, her painted smile the only thing in this room that didn't feel like a serrated blade. As my hand hovered over that cold, predatory document, I looked away from my daughter's expectant face and let my gaze anchor on the portrait. I didn't see the suit-clad lawyer or the representative with her glossy brochures. For a few precious heartbeats, the hostile air of the dining room thinned, and I was no longer a prisoner in my own home. I was back in the sanctuary of a memory, drifting to the last, truly peaceful Tuesday morning in September. The Portland rain had been a soft hum against the glass, and the house had smelled of cedar and the lavender sachet Maria always kept in her top drawer. I remembered the meticulous weight of her jewelry box in my lap as I sat on the edge of our bed, organizing the small treasures she'd left behind. It was a ritual of precision and love, much like the jet engines I had spent my life designing. I could almost hear her voice then, a gentle rasp that still carried the authority of her convictions. Silas promised me you'll keep the garden roses trimmed, she had said in my mind. They're your heart, even if you won't admit it. I had whispered back to the empty room that I would keep everything exactly where it belonged. Memory is a funny thing. It's the only place where the ghosts don't have to ask for permission to stay. In that quiet flashback, the house wasn't an asset or a liquidation event. It was the physical manifestation of 40 years of shared breaths. It was a monument of honest wood and stained glass. But the memory was a fragile shield. The sharp rhythmic tap of a manicured nail against the dining table began to pierce, click, click, click. Like a clock counting down my eviction, the senior living representative brought me crashing back to the present. She was leaning forward now, her glasses reflecting the harsh glare of the overhead chandelier. Most residents find they don't really need the heirlooms, she said, her voice dripping with a professional manufactured pity. It's about a fresh start, Mr. Thorne. We focus on downsizing the clutter to make room for the future. I felt a surge of indignation boil up from my chest. Clutter. She was talking about Maria's life as if it were nothing more than a pile of discarded newspaper. It's not a fresh start when you're burning the map of where you came from, I replied. My voice was steady, the pragmatic tone of an engineer who had seen enough failed designs to recognize a disaster when it was presented to him. I noticed Emily shift in her chair, her eyes darting away from her mother's portrait. She looked high-strung, her heels digging into the hardwood, as if she were trying to ground herself in a lie. I realized then that the representative wasn't a neutral advisor at all. She looked at Brian with a familiarity that suggested she was a paid consultant from his firm. A wolf in sheep's clothing sent to shepherd me into a pen. If my wife were here, would she recognize the woman my daughter has become? The lawyer. Vance cleared his throat and slid the pen closer. He insisted I at least read the legal definitions, his tone sounding like a practice script. Brian's patience was visibly eroding. He didn't have Emily's sales rep polish. He had the desperate, twitchy energy of a man who was running out of time. He didn't care about the transition. He cared about the equity. Just sign it. Silas Bryan snapped his facade of concern, slipping to reveal a cold, jagged aggression. Don't make this a scene in front of the help. I gripped the edge of the table, the rough grain of the wood pressing into my palm. This is my table, Brian, I said, the gravel in my voice more pronounced now, and you are the only one making a scene. I looked down at the document, my engineer's eyes automatically scanning the lines of text. Greed makes people sloppy. Right there in the legal description of the property Maria and I had deeded to each other, her name was misspelled. They had rushed this. They had treated the most important document of my life like a rough draft for a recruitment memo. I felt a cold, calculated sense of power reversal wash over me. I wasn't going to tell them. Not yet. I was going to let their own careless arrogance become their undoing. Brian's face turned a mottled shade of red, his jaw tightening until the muscle jumped. He couldn't stand the delay, and he certainly couldn't stand the fact that he hadn't won yet. I saw the predator break through the surface then. Brian's hand shot out his fingers, clamping onto the edge of the paper. As he tried to pull it closer to my shaking hand, his eyes finally showing the predator beneath the recruitment consultant. He was no longer trying to facilitate. He was trying to dominate. He wanted the ink, he wanted the house, and he wanted me gone so he could settle whatever debts were clearly chasing him. I didn't pull back. I met his gaze with the calm, reflective weight of a man who had survived more than a little turbulence in his time. The room felt like a pressure cooker. The hiss of the rain outside, the only thing keeping the walls from closing in entirely. I pulled my hand back, as if the mahogany table had suddenly turned white hot, watching Brian's manicured fingers dig into the paper like claws. The sound of the pen he had been pushing toward me, a cheap ballpoint that looked like an insult against the grain of the wood, rolled across the table and fell to the floor with a plastic clatter. That sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. I didn't look at Brian. I kept my eyes on Emily. The nostalgic haze of Maria's memory had been shredded by the physical aggression of my son-in-law, and what was left was a cold, clinical clarity. I stood up slowly, my joints stiff, and felt the weight of every one of my 70 years settle into a defensive armor. "Is this what Maria's daughter does?" I asked, my voice vibrating with a low, dangerous resonance. "She evicts her father before the pie is served." Emily didn't look away this time. The sales rep persona she had worn since walking through the door didn't just crack, it disintegrated. She stood up too, her designer heels clicking with an impatient staccato rhythm. "Don't bring Mom into this," she snapped. "This is about logic, Dad. This is about the future. You're living in a museum, and Brian and I are the ones paying for the upkeep of a life you can't manage anymore." The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 5. It sounded like a funeral bell marking the exact moment the child I had raised became a stranger I didn't recognize. The sheer entitlement in her voice was breathtaking, a jagged shard of greed that she wasn't even trying to hide anymore. I looked at the turkey now cold and glistening with congealed fat, and felt a wave of crushing disillusionment. "Logic," I repeated. "There is no logic in theft, Emily. There is only desperation." At what point does a daughter stop being a child and start being a predator? She leaned over the table, her face inches from mine, her eyes reflecting the harsh overhead light. "Sooner or later, this house will be mine anyway," she said. The words were delivered with a flat, rehearsed finality that made my skin crawl. "You're just a tenant in your own history now. Go to the nursing home where you can be monitored. My husband's family needs this house. Brian needs a real start, and you're just rattling around in a museum." The nauseating betrayal hit me then, a physical blow to the solar plexus. She wasn't waiting for me to pass away. She was treating me as if I were already dead, a ghost, whose only remaining duty was to vacate the premises for the sake of her husband's secret debts. Brian nodded in the background, his opportunistic eyes scanning the room, as if he were already measuring for new furniture. "We've already looked into the involuntary commitment procedures," Emily added, her voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than a scream. "If you continue to be difficult about your own welfare, we will have no choice but to let the state decide what's best for you." I felt a surge of trembling rage, the kind that only comes when you realize the person you would have died for is the one holding the shovel. The stillness that followed wasn't peace. It was the ringing in my ears after a bomb went off. I looked at the lawyer who was studiously avoiding my gaze, and then at the senior living rep, who was already tucking her brochures back into her bag with the practiced indifference of someone who had seen this drama 1,000 times. "Out," I said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command forged in the fires of the engineering bays where I had spent 40 years making sure machines didn't fall out of the sky. "All of you. Now." Emily laughed, a short, brittle sound that had no humor in it. "Fine. Have it your way," she said, grabbing her briefcase. "But don't call me when the roof leaks and you're too old to fix it. You're making a very expensive mistake, Silas." Brian stood up, his posture shifting back to a smug, dismissive arrogance. He followed Emily toward the door, but as they passed through the entryway, he paused just long enough to lean back into the dining room. He whispered something to Emily, but in the hollow quiet of my home, the words carried like a scream. "We'll let the bank do the talking next time," he said. The heavy thud of the front door slamming shut vibrated through the floorboards, rattling the china in the cabinet. I stood in the center of my kitchen, the smell of the turkey, now a sickening reminder of the ambush, my hands still shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and grief. The Portland rain had intensified, drumming against the roof with a relentless rhythmic pressure. I was alone, but the quiet didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a countdown. I looked at the table, the empty chairs, the untouched food, and the quitclaim deed that still sat there like a venomous snake in the middle of my life. What did Brian mean by letting the bank do the talking? Was the house already encumbered? Had they forged more than just my signature on their imagination? Instead, I navigated the shadows by memory, making my way down the narrow hallway to my workshop. The smell of cedar usually brings me peace, but tonight, it just felt like the scent of a box I was being buried in while I was still breathing. I sat on my stool, my back curved against the weight of the last 48 hours. I had spent 2 days in a catatonic state of grief and suspicion, moving only when the survival instincts of an engineer demanded it. I tried to lose myself in my woodworking, but my hands shook too much to hold a chisel, and the sharp edge of the blade felt more like a threat than a tool. Every time the house creaked, I heard Brian's cryptic threat about the bank, or Emily's cold voice promising to put me in a home. Is it still a home if the people you love treat it like a carcass they're waiting to pick clean? I looked at my workbench, seeing the unfinished birdhouse I had intended for Leo's birthday. I had built this house for Emily. Every joint, every beam, every meticulously sanded floorboard. And now she wanted to tear it all down, just to collect a commission and settle her husband's debts. I felt a wave of deep isolation wash over me, a despair so thick it felt like physical pain in my chest. I realized that by leaving everything to her in my current will, I had essentially signed my own death warrant. To Brian and Emily, I wasn't a father anymore. I was just a barrier between them and $780,000. I stood up, my joints protesting, and retreated to my study to review my estate documents. I needed to see the damage. The phone felt like it weighed 50 pounds as I moved it aside to open the small floor safe. My fingers were numb as I spun the dial, the cold metallic clicks echoing in the quiet room. When I pulled out my legal folder, my heart stopped. Several pages from my own copy of the property deed were missing. The staple had been pried back and the primary schedule of assets was gone. Someone had been through my safe before. I felt a surge of nausea. Emily still had her emergency key. She hadn't been waiting for Thanksgiving to start her siege. She had been scouting the terrain for months. I sat back in my leather chair looking at Maria's photograph on the desk. "Maria, did you see this coming?" I whispered to the glass. Was I the only one wearing blinders? As I reached back into the safe to put the folder away, my hand brushed against something I hadn't noticed in years. It was a thick, dust-covered accordion file tucked into the very back behind the old tax returns. I pulled it out, the black plastic gritty under my touch. It was labeled in Maria's elegant, precise hand. I realized then that if Emily and Brian moved forward with a conservatorship, my current legal setup offered me zero protection. I was vulnerable, an old man in a big house with a target on his back. Isolation is a slow poison, but a familiar voice is the only antivenom that works. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the contact list, trembling. I called the number 3 times and hung up before it could even ring, the fear of being a burden, warring with the terror of being a victim. But the memory of Brian's cold, predatory eyes at dinner finally pushed me over the edge. I dialed again and forced myself to wait. On the 4th ring, the line clicked open. Silas, a voice barked gravelly and full of the same sharp authority I remembered from 30 years ago. Rob Morrison, 74. A retired appellate attorney who still carried the scent of old law books and expensive whiskey even over the phone, didn't wait for a greeting. "I've been waiting for this call for 10 years, Silas. You sound like hell." I felt the dam of my composure finally break at the sound of his voice. "Rob, it's Silas," I managed to say, my voice raspy and thin. "I think I'm in trouble. Serious trouble." There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind of silence a judge gives before delivering a sentence. "Silas, don't touch anything in that house," Rob said, his voice dropping to a low legal growl that made me sit up straighter. "I'm bringing the locksmith and the folder Maria left me. Don't open the door for anyone else. Do you understand?" I nodded to the empty room, a spark of hope finally flickering in the dark. "I understand," I whispered. I sat there in the dark listening to the dial tone, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt like the walls weren't closing in. They were just holding the line until help arrived. The sound of Rob's car tires eventually crunching on the gravel driveway was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I watched the headlights sweep across the front of the house, 2 beams of light cutting through the Portland mist, and I knew that the countdown was finally over. The battle for my life was about to begin in earnest. The headlights of Rob's sedan cut through the Portland drizzle like two surgical beams sweeping across the front of my house as if searching for a pulse. I stood by the window, my breath fogging the glass, watching the familiar silhouette of Rob Morrison climb out of the driver's seat. He didn't look like a man in his mid-70s. He moved with the brisk, aggressive efficiency of someone who had spent his life winning arguments in high-ceilinged courtrooms. By the time I reached the front door, he was already on the porch, a weathered leather portfolio tucked under his arm, and the faint scent of rain and expensive whiskey clinging to his wool coat. He didn't offer a platitude. He just stepped inside, gave my shoulder a firm, grounding squeeze, and headed straight for the living room. I followed him, feeling the heavy, suffocating silence of the house finally begin to lift. Rob didn't waste time with tea. He cleared my mail off the coffee table with a single sweep of his hand and began spreading out a series of yellowed, notarized documents. I watched mesmerized as he pulled a thick accordion file from his portfolio, the same one I had seen Maria carry to lunch with the girls 2 months before she died. "She told me you were too good of a man to see the shark in your own waters," Silas Robb said, his eyes scanning the first page. "She came to my office in secret. She knew Emily's ambition was beginning to outpace her empathy even then." My pulse spiked as I looked at the papers. "She did this 12 years ago. While she was sick," Rob nodded, his jaw set. "She was a mother, but she was also a realist. She moved the house into a structure that bypasses standard probate, entirely making it untouchable by Emily's involuntary claims." I felt a surge of awe at Maria's foresight, coupled with a crushing weight of guilt. I had spent a decade thinking I was the one protecting her memory, never realizing she had spent her final days building a fortress around mine. "Silas, look at this." Rob tapped a specific line on a document titled Enhanced Life Estate Deed. Most people call it a ladybird deed. It gave you absolute control and ownership until the moment you draw your last breath. But Maria went further. A legal document is just paper and ink until someone tries to set your life on fire. Then it's a fire extinguisher. She established a restricted trust, and this right here is the trigger. He pointed to a section labeled Article 6. It was a no-contest forfeiture clause. Rob explained in that low clinical growl of his that any beneficiary who attempted to interfere with my peaceful possession of the property would forfeit their entire inheritance immediately. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a legal landmine. If Emily pushes, she loses every cent of the $450,000 Maria left for her. My hands were shaking. I could hear the paper rattling against the wood of the coffee table, like dry leaves in a storm. She didn't trust her own daughter. I whispered the words, tasting like ash. That's the hardest part to swallow. How many nights had she sat beside me, watching the sunset from this very room, knowing she was building a fortress? I wouldn't even know I needed for a decade. The daughter I raised had vanished, leaving only a stranger with an emotionless gaze as I realized the missing pages from my safe, the ones I discovered earlier, were actually stolen by Emily months ago. She had been hunting for these very trust documents, trying to find a way to circumvent the trap Maria had set for her. Rob reached into the bottom of the file and produced a single sheet of stationery. The paper was ivory with Maria's elegant looping cursive flowing across it. I took it from him, my fingers tracing the indentations of her pen. "Protect yourself, Silas," she had written. "I love her, but I know what we raised. Don't let them take your peace. Proof will be your only currency when blood turns cold." The handwriting seemed to vibrate under my touch, her voice echoing from the grave with a heartbreaking clarity that made the room spin. I sat back heavily in my chair, the scent of her old lavender perfume seemingly rising from the stationery. I felt a strange cold comfort in the fact that Maria had seen the wolves at the door, long before I ever heard them howling. If my wife were here, would she recognize the woman my daughter has become? Or had she already seen the predator Emily was destined to be? Rob stood up and walked toward the window, his reflection ghostly against the dark Portland sky. He was silent for a long moment, giving me space to breathe through the grief and the revelation. But the quiet was short-lived. My phone sitting on the wooden side table suddenly began to vibrate. The sound was jarring, a violent rattle that sounded like a rattlesnake in the grass. I looked down and saw Brian's name flashing on the screen. He wasn't calling, he was texting. I picked up the device, my thumb hovering over the glass. The message was long, a rambling, manipulative request for $15,000, once again citing the grandchildren's tuition and emergency fees. It was wrapped in the same false warmth that had characterized his performance at Thanksgiving. But now, with Maria's warning in my hand and Rob's legal shield on the table, the words looked like nothing more than a crude attempt at a shakedown. I looked up from Maria's note and saw Rob staring at my phone, his expression tightening into one of focused professional disgust. My blood turned to ice as I realized this was only the beginning of Brian's desperation. Rob reached out and took the phone from my hand, his eyes tracking the text with a terrifyingly calm intensity. "Silas, don't answer him," he said quietly. "Yes, I think it's time I did some digging into where Mr. Redmond is actually spending his time." I stayed frozen, the ivory paper still clutched in my left hand, finally understanding that the war Maria had prepared me for was no longer a threat. It was here. The vibration of my phone against the mahogany table sounded like the rattle of a snake, and the text from Brian was just as venomous a request for $15,000 wrapped in a lie about my grandchildren's future. I stared at the screen, the blue light etching the lines of my face in the darkened dining room. Rob was still sitting across from me, his leather portfolio open, but his attention was now locked on the digital demand pulsing between us. The text claimed that the boys Leo and his younger brother were at risk of losing their priority spots at an elite private school unless a deposit was made by noon the following day. It was a classic Brian maneuver leverage, the one thing I couldn't say no to the legacy of my family. I felt a surge of defensive grit. Coached by the revelations in Maria's secret file, I didn't respond immediately. I waited knowing that a predator like Brian couldn't help but circle back to check the scent of the trail. Less than an hour later, the smell of Brian's expensive cloying cologne drifted onto my front porch. He didn't ring the bell. He knocked with the practiced rhythm of a man who believed he was still a welcome member of the household. When I opened the door, he had shifted his persona back to the concerned family man. He held a stack of glossy clinical brochures for the street. Jude Preparatory Academy, the paper smooth and expensive under the porch light. He looked at me with those wide, earnest eyes that I now recognized as the mask of a seasoned recruiter. "It's about their education, Silas," he said, his voice dropping into that warm, persuasive register he used to secure high-level talent. "Don't let your pride hurt the kids. I've spoken to the admissions office and they're holding the spots as a personal favor, but they need that $15,000 now." I watched him closely. As a retired engineer, I was trained to look for stress fractures, and they were there, the slight twitch in his jaw, the way he wouldn't hold my gaze for more than a second. A bead of sweat rolled down Brian's temple. The salesman was starting to crack. "I'm not co-signing a loan for a spot that hasn't been earned yet." "Brian," I replied, my voice gravelly and firm. "I'm on a fixed retirement income, and as you were so keen to remind me at Thanksgiving, I have to be careful with my resources." He stiffened, the brochures crinkling in his hand. He tried to argue to play on the memory of Maria's wishes, but I held the line like a seasoned general. When he finally realized the well was dry, the mask slipped entirely. He turned and marched back to his car without another word, the hydraulic hiss of his luxury sedan's door closing like a final dismissal. After the red glow of his taillights faded, I drove to Rob's office. The city of Portland was a blur of gray mist and neon signs, but my focus was sharp. Rob was waiting his computer screen, casting a cold blue light glare across his desk. He had been digging into the digital paper trail Brian had tried so hard to bury. "He's not looking for tuition." "Silas," Rob said, his voice a low legal growl. "He's looking for a life raft." Rob turned the monitor toward me. It was a list of active liabilities. Brian had $47,000 in gambling debt spread across 3 local casinos and a predatory underground bookie in Beaverton. The $15,000 wasn't for school. It was the minimum payment required to keep his creditors from escalating their collection methods. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. $47,000. "He's gambling away my daughter's life," I whispered. But Rob wasn't finished. He had found something even more devastating. Brian hadn't just lied about the tuition. He had accessed the children's existing college savings accounts, the ones Maria and I had funded for years, and used them as collateral for his latest bender. How do you explain to a daughter that the man she loves is a hole in the ground that will eventually swallow her whole? The betrayal was so deep it felt structural, a flaw in the foundation of my family that I had been too blind to see. I sat in the weight of the investigation pressing down on me. I realized that the senior living brochures Brian had brought to Thanksgiving weren't just about my health. They were part of a referral program. Brian had been pre-approved for a 10% finder's fee for moving me into a facility. He wasn't trying to protect me. He was trying to liquidate me for a commission. My phone rang again. It was Emily. I answered, hoping for a voice of reason, but the shaky, high-pitched vibration of her tone told me the poison had already spread. Brian told me you turned your back on the boys. She cried, her voice full of a directed bitterness. He said you refused to help with their school because you're still angry about the dinner. How can you be so selfish, Dad? They're your grandchildren. Emily, listen to me. Brian is lying to you about where that money is going, I tried to say, but the words were met with a sharp industrial click. She had hung up. Watch the eyes. When the words are sweet but the eyes are calculating, you're not talking to a son-in-law, you're talking to a vulture. I stood in the ringing in my ears of my kitchen after Emily hung up the dial tone, sounding like a flatline, and realized that being right was going to be the loneliest thing I'd ever experienced. I looked at the calendar on the wall, the date of Leo's 8th birthday circled in red, and I knew that the battle lines were no longer just legal, they were personal. I was being erased from the lives of the people I loved most, not because of my age, but because I was the only thing standing between a predator and his next fix. The red circle on my calendar felt like a target I'd missed, a reminder that I'd been effectively erased from the only family I had left. It was my grandson Leo's 8th birthday, and for the first time in his life, I wasn't waking up to the frantic energy of a small boy asking if it was time for cake. The house was too quiet, a hollowed-out vessel of a life I no longer recognized. I stood in my kitchen, the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air, and stared at that circle until my eyes blurred. I had stood in this same spot 48 hours ago, listening to the flatline of the dial tone after Emily hung up on me, but the silence this morning felt even more industrial. I reached out and touched the paper of the calendar, the grain rough under my fingertips. I didn't have an invitation. I didn't have a time or a place. I just had the cold clinical knowledge that a wall had been built around me, and my own daughter was the one holding the mortar. I spent the early morning at the small desk in the breakfast nook, my hand steadying only when I gripped the pen. I wrote out a birthday card, my handwriting a bit more jagged than it used to be. Happy birthday, Leo, I wrote. I hope you remember who taught you how to build those Lego sets. I slipped a $50 bill inside, though the money felt like a ghost reaching out from a grave, an offering to a child who might be told his grandfather simply forgot him. I walked down the driveway to the mailbox, the gravel crunching under my slippers. The autumn air was damp, carrying the smell of stale paper and wet cedar. I waited there, leaning against the post, hoping against hope that the mailman might bring a last-minute miracle, a late card, a change of heart, anything. But when the truck finally rattled by, there were only bills and a glossy neon orange flyer for a storage unit facility. The irony was a physical blow. The mailman didn't even look up. To him, I was just another address. To my daughter, I was an obstacle. I realized then that the isolation Brian and Emily had threatened wasn't just a mood, it was a strategy. I went back inside and checked the online portal for Leo's school, something I'd done 1,000 times to see his progress. My login worked, but when I scrolled to the emergency contact section, my breath hitched. My name was gone. In the space where I had been listed for years, a new name sat in sterile black font, Adria Redmond. I felt a surge of betrayal so cold it made my teeth ache. Emily had already stripped me of my role as a protector. Adria Redmond, 72. Brian's mother sat in my place now. I had only met her a handful of times, a woman with a posture as rigid as her convictions, her voice a low melodic hum of traditional entitlement that made cruelty sound like common sense. I couldn't stay in the house. The ringing in my ears was starting to feel like a confession. I grabbed my coat and drove to the Eastmoreland district, pulling up to a local cafe where the coffee was strong and the noise of strangers might drown out my own thoughts. I took a corner table hiding behind a folded copy of the Oregonian, just looking for a moment of normalcy. But fate has a wicked sense of timing. 10 minutes after I sat down, the bell above the door chimed and I saw Emily walk in. She wasn't alone. She was with Adria Redmond. They took a booth 3 rows away, their backs to me. I sat perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs, the porcelain of my cup clinking softly as I set it down. I shouldn't have listened, but when I heard my own name, the newspaper became a shield. A good wife understands that the lineage must be preserved, Emily Adria was saying, her voice carrying that effortless, terrifying hum. Your father is just a relic now. He's served his purpose, but he's clinging to an era that doesn't exist anymore. Brian needs the equity to secure the boy's future. It's your duty to prioritize the family that is growing, not the one that is fading. I felt the heat rise in my neck. When did my own kitchen become a place I had to defend like a fortress? I heard Emily sigh, a sound of exhausted surrender. I know she said, her voice small. but he's making it so difficult. He thinks he's still the one in charge. He won't just see reason. Adria's response was clinical. We can have the carpets replaced by December. She said as if she were discussing a weather report. He won't even notice once he's in the home. The master bedroom has the best light for Brian's office. It's simply the most logical use of the square footage. They weren't just waiting for the house. They were measuring my life for the casket, calculating the value of my displacement. I couldn't listen anymore. The bitterness in my throat was too much to swallow. I slipped out of the booth, leaving my coffee untouched, and walked out the door before they could turn around. The Portland rain had started a cold, needle-like drizzle that soaked through my coat in seconds. The rain wasn't just water. It was the cold clarity of knowing exactly where I stood, outside looking in. I stood on the sidewalk shivering and looked across the street toward the park. That's when I saw him. George Redmond was standing near the corner holding a clipboard and pointing toward the upper windows of my house, my workshop, while talking to a man in a neon yellow contractor's vest. They were looking at the roofline, the contractor nodding as he made a notation on a blueprint. The contractor didn't see me, but he saw my house, and the way he marked a red X on a blueprint in his hand made my stomach lurch with a new kind of terror. They weren't just planning a move. They were planning a demolition of the life Maria and I had built, and they weren't even waiting for me to leave to start the appraisal. The house didn't just feel cold when I stepped through the mudroom. It felt dead, the hum of the refrigerator silenced like a heart that had finally stopped beating. I stood in the absolute darkness of the kitchen, the only light coming from the street lamps outside, reflecting off the damp Portland pavement. My breath hitched, coming out in a faint silvery plume. Just an hour ago, I had seen that contractor marking a red X on a blueprint of my life, and now it seemed the demolition had already begun. I reached for the light switch by the door, clicking it up and down with a frantic, useless rhythm. Nothing. The air was heavy, smelling of cold, stagnant air, and the faint, ghostly scent of the dinner I had tried to cook for a family that no longer wanted me. I navigated the familiar terrain of my home by touch my hand, trailing along the edge of the granite countertop, until I reached the hallway. I felt a surge of simmering outrage. My neighbors' houses were glowing with the warm amber light of Tuesday evening, but my craftsman was a black hole in the middle of the block. I made my way to the laundry room, where the breaker panel was housed, pulling a small LED flashlight from my pocket. The beam cut through the gloom, landing on the gray metal door. I swung it open and scanned the switches. Every single one was in the on position. This wasn't a tripped circuit. This was deliberate. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the blue-white glare of the screen blinding me for a second in the dark room. I dialed Portland General Electric, my fingers trembling as I navigated the automated menu. When a human voice finally crackled onto the line, I didn't lead with a question. I led with a demand. "My power is out and my breakers are fine," I said, my voice sounding gravelly and authoritative despite the cold. "I am Silas Thorne at 1422 Maple Drive." There was a long pause, the sound of keys tapping on the other end. I watched the digital clock on the oven through the doorway. The digital clock on the oven was dead, zeros staring back at me like empty eyes. "Sir, our records show an emergency service suspension," the representative explained. "A report was filed by your daughter Emily Redmond, citing a severe electrical hazard and a suspected gas leak near the main line. As a family member on the contingency list, she requested an immediate shutoff for structural preservation until a certified technician could inspect the property. She has also submitted a pending application to take over the account as the proposed conservator." I felt the blood rush to my head, a dizzying mix of fear and fury. "I am the deeded owner of this property," I said, forcing each word through gritted teeth. "And I assure you, my stove is quite cold. My daughter is attempting to seize my home through fraud. Sir, we have a recorded request from your next of kin regarding your cognitive safety." She repeated as if reading from a script that had already judged me. I spent the next 20 minutes in a frantic, exhausting battle of identities. I had to prove I was still alive, still sane, and still the man who paid the bills. The clerk was hesitant, bound by the safety flag Emily had successfully planted like a landmine in my credit file. I had to set up a mobile hotspot, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. I scanned my enhanced life estate deed, the one Rob had verified, and my driver's license, emailing them to a secured portal while the dusk faded into a deep, unforgiving night. How many more bills are being rerouted to her house while I sit here thinking I'm in control? It was then that I noticed a crumpled envelope at the bottom of my internal mail slot. I smoothed it out under the flashlight beam. It was a final shut-off notice for the water department dated 3 days ago. Emily hadn't just targeted the power, she had already successfully moved the water bill into her name and let the balance lapse to trigger a crisis. Just as the lights suddenly flickered back to life, the jarring hum of the refrigerator restarting felt like a taunt rather than a relief. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was Brian. I answered, my voice cold as the air around me. "Silas, I heard there was a power issue in the neighborhood," he said, his tone dripping with a fake oily concern. "We were just worried you were sitting in the dark, Silas. It's not safe for a man your age. Maybe I should come over and check the furnace. I saw through it instantly." He wasn't checking on me. He was checking to see if the dark had broken my resolve. "The only thing unsafe in this house right now, Brian, is the reception on this phone," I replied. "I don't need a visitor, and I certainly don't need your help. Good night." Turning the power back on didn't make the house feel warmer. It just illuminated the battle lines more clearly. I stood in the bright artificial glare of my kitchen, looking at the deadbolts on the back door. The PGE representative had mentioned one last detail before hanging up, something that made the hair on my neck stand up. She said a locksmith inquiry had been made earlier that morning to verify emergency access rights for the property. The shrill ring of the telephone again sounded through the hollow silence of my kitchen. But this time, the caller ID displayed a name I actually trusted. When my phone rang at 8 p.m., I didn't expect to hear the voice of the man who had treated my high blood pressure for 20 years, telling me I was being hunted by a pen. Dr. Eris Kellen, a man with a voice like worn velvet and a bedside manner that hadn't changed in 30 years, spoke with the heavy weight of professional betrayal. He didn't waste time with small talk. "Silas, I had a visitor today," he said, and I could hear the rhythmic tapping of a pen against his desk on the other end. "Your son-in-law, Brian Redmond, came by my office. He had a document already typed up, Silas. He just wanted my signature on a statement regarding your rapidly declining cognitive state to protect your assets, as he put it." I felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. "I've designed jet engines. Aris," I replied, my voice gravelly and thick with a new kind of dread. "I think I can manage my own checkbook." The doctor let out a heavy sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 ethics board meetings. I told him to leave, but you need to understand the scale of this. He wasn't just asking for a diagnosis, he was seeking a medical basis for a conservatorship. Brian wasn't just coming for the house, he was coming for my mind. He was trying to declare me legally dead while I was still breathing, stripping away my agency before I even realized the trap had been set. Eris warned me that while he had refused other doctors, less scrupulous ones, or those Brian might manipulate with the same clinical efficiency he used in recruitment, might not be so steadfast. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling as I set it on the granite counter. Chilled horror and a profound sense of betrayal settled into my bones. But the doctor hadn't even given me the full extent of the nightmare. A few minutes later, my email chimed. It was an automated notification from a state portal. Brian hadn't just called the doctor, he had actually sent an anonymous elder abuse tip to Adult Protective Services against me. The report claimed I was being neglected by my own isolation and that my home was becoming a hazard. He was building a cage of lies, and the bars were made of official government stationery. I realized then that I was no longer just defending a piece of real estate. I was fighting for the very right to exist as a free man. I called Rob Morrison immediately. Within the hour, his headlights swept across the front of the house. Rob arrived with a trunk full of high-definition wireless cameras and sensors, his expression as grim as a soldier's before a breach. We spent the next 6 hours turning my historic Craftsman into a surveillance fortress. I felt the cold weight of the metal ladder against my shoulder as I climbed to the eaves to mount the first lens. We worked in a focused clinical silence, the smell of rain-soaked cedar rising from the porch as the Portland mist turned into a steady drizzle. Rob explained the legal necessity of what he called Chekhov's gun. "We need a 360-degree view, Silas," he said, his voice a low growl as he tightened a bracket. "If they so much as touch your doorknob, we're going to have it in 4K. We need video evidence that will prevent Brian from manufacturing a civil standby or a safety concern out of thin air. This is your witness when no one else is watching. Is it still a sanctuary if you have to rig it with wires and glass just to sleep through the night?" I wondered. "I used to watch the stars from this porch, Rob," I said, looking out at the dark street. "Now I'm watching for my own daughter." We didn't stop until every corner of the property was covered. We rigged the mudroom, the backyard, and the side entrance near the cellar. Finally, we sat in the living room, the glow of a tablet illuminating Rob's tired face. He tapped the screen, and I heard the high-pitched beep of camera activation. The system went live, and I viewed my home through the fisheye lenses for the first time. The familiar hallways looked strange, distorted into sterile corridors. The infrared sensors turned the backyard into a ghostly green landscape, where every shifting shadow was rendered in sharp digital clarity. Systems Green Rob said, leaning back, "You're recording to the cloud now, Silas. They can't delete this, and they can't lie their way past a timestamp. It feels like I've lived here 40 years, just to become a prisoner in a cage." "I built myself," I replied. The camera lens stared at the front walk like a cold, unblinking eye, a mechanical witness for a father who no longer had a daughter. A grim satisfaction settled over me, though it was hollowed out by grief. The red blinking lights on the cameras were the only things currently keeping me safe from my own blood. We spent another hour testing the motion zones. As I panned the camera at the end of the block, my heart stopped. "Rob, look at this," I said, handing him the tablet. In the grainy green-tinted infrared view, we saw a strange car parked under a dead street lamp. It was the same sedan I had seen outside the cafe. The same contractor was sitting in the driver's seat with a clipboard, his face illuminated by the glow of a smartphone, as he looked directly at my house. He wasn't even hiding anymore. He was an appraiser for a demolition that hadn't been authorized by the owner, but had already been promised by the heirs. The red light on the porch camera blinked once, twice, then stayed solid, catching the silhouette of someone standing at the edge of my property just beyond the reach of the streetlights. The doorbell didn't ring. It shrieked, breaking the heavy Saturday morning silence like a warning siren I should have heeded before opening the door to a family of ghosts. I stood in the foyer, my hand gripping the cold brass knob, watching through the sidelight as a small army gathered on my porch. It was barely 10 o'clock, and the Portland mist was clinging to the eaves of the house, making everything look damp and gray. I pulled the door open, expecting perhaps a delivery or a neighbor. Instead, I found Emily and Brian flanking two people I hadn't seen in nearly a year. Brian's parents, Adria and George Redmond, stood there with the practiced poise of people who were arriving for an appointment they had already paid for. They didn't wait for an invitation. Brian nudged past me, followed by his father, while the women swept inside with a rustle of expensive wool and the suffocating smell of mothballs and entitlement. Brian's father, George Redmond, was a man of 74 who carried a professional 60-foot metal measuring tape like a scepter, his eyes constantly appraising the value of things that didn't belong to him. He didn't look at me. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply stepped into the hallway and looked up at the crown molding. "The light in here is sufficient, Brian, but we'll need to modernize the fixtures if we're going to make this work," the elder George said, his voice a dry rasp of authority. I stood there stunned by the sheer arrogance of the intrusion. "I am still standing right here in the house I paid for," I said, my voice dropping into that gravely register that usually commanded respect. No one acknowledged me. It was as if I had already become a ghost in my own hallways. They began a methodical circuit of the ground floor, treating the visit like a final walkthrough for a move-in plan they had already finalized in private. I followed them, my chest tightening with a rising cold fury as I realized the scale of the dehumanization. They weren't visiting. They were auditing. Emily stayed close to Adria, pointing out the built-in bookshelves Maria had loved, while the men discussed structural integrity as if I were a tenant they were about to evict. The daughter I raised had vanished, leaving only a stranger with cold, calculating eyes that Brian's father had a set of keys in his hand, a silver ring of brass keys I recognized instantly. Emily had given him his own set to my house, without ever mentioning a word to me. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, a leaden realization that the locks I relied on were already compromised from the inside. We moved into the living room, where the gray dust motes danced in the morning light they were so busy appraising. Brian's father stopped in the center of the rug and reached for the silver casing on his belt. Before I explain what that metal measuring tape was actually for, if you are still with me, comment A if you think I should have thrown them out right then, or B if I was right to keep watching. Add one reason why, so I can see your perspective. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes to show the emotional weight of this moment. The purpose is reflection. The metallic zing of the tape measure suddenly sliced through the air, the sound snapping open like a gunshot in the quiet room. Click, snap. The tape measure retracted with the sound of a closing trap. George Redmond began stretching the yellow blade across the floor, measuring the distance from the fireplace to the window. "We'll need to pull up this hardwood," he muttered to Brian. "Adria wants a neutral plush carpet for the transition. It's better for the joints at our age. They began discussing where my leftovers, the furniture Maria and I had spent decades collecting, would be stored or liquidated. I watched them stand in Maria's favorite reading nook, the one with the built-in bench that caught the afternoon sun, and treat it like nothing more than wasted square footage for a guest suite. How do you tell a man measuring your bedroom for his own bed that he's still a stranger in your house? When I was your age, Silas Bryan's father said, finally looking at me with a condescending tilt of his head, I knew when to step aside for the sake of the bloodline. Bryan is the man of the household now. It's time you let him lead. The room felt smaller, the air thick with their shared assumptions. I felt the vibration of the surveillance cameras behind the walls recording every clinical word, every insult disguised as logic. You haven't seen true greed until you've seen a family measure the distance between your life and your inheritance. My patience finally snapped like the metal tape in his hand. Out, I said the word, emerging as a low, dangerous rumble. All of you, get out of my house now. Adria looked at me with a pitying smile that was more insulting than a scream, her head tilting as if she were observing a confused animal. We'll see you on Thursday, Dad. Emily said, her voice tight with a forced patience that signaled she was already reporting this outburst to her mental health file. Try to be in a better state by then. We have a lot to finalize. I walked them to the porch, my hands shaking with an icy resolve. I will be exactly where I belong. On Thursday, I replied, watching them retreat to their cars with a sense of triumph. They left the measuring tape behind on the hall table, a silent metallic promise of their return. I picked it up, feeling the cold, heavy weight of the metal casing in my palm. It felt like a weapon they had forgotten. As I turned it over, I saw something tucked into the belt clip. It was a business card for a demolition and remodel firm, with a handwritten note on the back, gut garden room first. I gripped the cold metal of the measuring tape until it bit into my palm, the business card for the demolition crew, mocking me from the table. The heavy receding gravel crunch of their luxury tires echoed through the house, a rhythmic metallic promise that they would be back to finish the job. I was no longer a father. I was just a wall in their way, and the silence that followed their departure sounded exactly like a countdown. The amber liquid in my glass was the same color as the sunset I'd watched from this porch for 40 years, but tonight the horizon looked like the edge of a battlefield. I sat in the dining room with Rob Morrison, the sharp, peaty scent of the whiskey, acting as a grounding wire for my fraying nerves. On the table between us lay the business card I had found, the one for the demolition crew, and the metal measuring tape that had felt like a surveyor's stake in my own heart. We weren't just two old friends sharing a drink anymore. We were a general and his strategist reviewing the enemy's movements before the dawn. Rob had spent the last few hours finalizing the legal dossier, his fingers moving with a clinical precision over the documents that Maria had hidden like landmines in a field of flowers. He tapped the Ladybird deed and the trust forfeiture terms with a grim satisfaction. Maria didn't build this house to be a paycheck for Brian's gambling debts, Silas, he said, his voice dropping into that authoritative growl. She knew they would come for the marrow once the meat was gone. I looked at the portrait of my wife on the wall, her painted eyes seemingly watching the whiskey swirl in my glass. I admitted to Rob, then the one thing that had been paralyzing me, the fear that if I won this fight, I would lose my daughter forever. But Rob didn't let me wallow. He reminded me that Emily had already made her choice the moment she handed the keys to her father-in-law and invited a demolition crew to gut her mother's memory. We shared a final toast to Maria, acknowledging that her foresight was the only thing standing between me and a sterile room in a nursing home. The law is a cold shadow until you're the one standing in the sun. It protects only those who have the courage to invoke it. Thanksgiving Day arrived, not with the warmth of family, but with a deceptive Portland mist that clung to the windows like a shroud. I had prepared a modest meal, the heavy cloying smell of the sage stuffing filling the kitchen, a sensory ghost of better years. When the doorbell finally rang at 2 o'clock, I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. I opened the door to find Emily and Brian, but they were merely the vanguard. Flanking them were Brian's parents, Adria and George Redmond, looking like they were ready to select the drapes. Behind them stood two strangers I hadn't expected. One was Vance Sterling, a lawyer with a mouth that moved like a shark's and a suit that cost more than my first 2 cars combined. Sat across from me with a laptop already open, like an altar to greed. Beside him was Marcia Hale, the senior living representative who wore a smile that was too wide and too white, holding a briefcase that smelled of antiseptic and expensive institutional furniture. They didn't ask to come in. They simply occupied the space, treating me like a guest in my own home. They set 8 place settings at my table, ignoring the simple 3 I had prepared. The silver platter was empty. They weren't here for the meat. They were here for the marrow. As the festivities began, I noticed Marcia pulling out a thick contract before the turkey was even carved. Emily leaned toward me, her voice dripping with a manufactured tenderness that made my skin crawl. "We thought a professional environment would help facilitate the transition, Dad," she said. I looked her in the eye, feeling the weight of the hidden surveillance cameras, recording every syllable of this orchestrated betrayal. "It's Thanksgiving, Emily," I replied. "Usually we facilitate a second helping of stuffing not a legal surrender." I saw Vance Sterling's fingers dance across the clinical coldness of his laptop screen. It was then that I noticed a document Marcia had partially obscured. It was a pre-signed psychiatric evaluation form, already filled out with Emily's false testimonies about my cognitive decline. My daughter hadn't just brought a lawyer. She had brought a pre-packaged insanity plea to strip me of my rights. I felt a surge of cold fury, but I kept my hand steady as I reached for my phone under the table. I sent the pre-arranged text to Rob. "The vultures have landed." Yesterday, Vance Sterling didn't waste any more time with pleasantries. He slid a document toward me, the same quitclaim deed from the first ambush, now updated with terms so aggressive they practically smelled of ink and desperation. "Sign here, Silas," he said, his shark-like mouth twisting into a smile. "Let's make this a celebration of your new chapter. It's for the best. How many times can you break a father's heart before the pieces turn into shrapnel?" I looked at the pen he was offering, then at Emily, who was carefully avoiding my gaze. "I think we should wait for my counsel to arrive before I sign anything," I said, my voice ringing out with a pragmatic authority that caused the room to go still. Brian laughed a sharp, dismissive sound. "Your counsel, Silas. You're confused. You don't have anyone." At that exact moment, the front door chime boomed through the house, a sudden jarring sound that made Adria jump. I didn't move. I simply watched as the silhouette of Rob Morrison appeared behind the frosted glass of the entry. The silence in the dining room became absolute, the only sound the faint whir of Vance's laptop fan. I saw the flash of confusion on Brian's face, followed quickly by a flicker of genuine fear. Rob didn't just walk in. He stepped into the light of the dining room with a tablet held high. I didn't look at the screen. I slowly reached out and slid the cold, untouched turkey platter toward the center of the table, a silent signal that the feast of lies was over. My thumb hit the record button on my own phone, and I leaned back ready to watch the vultures finally realize they were the ones being hunted. Rob stepped into the dining room, his leather portfolio looking like a shield, and looked Emily straight in the eye as he said, "I believe we have much more to discuss than a simple change of address." Rob didn't wait for an invitation. He pulled out the spare chair Emily had intended for Brian's father and dropped his leather portfolio onto the lace tablecloth with a thud that rattled the china. The ringing in my ears that followed was so thick I could hear the turkey fat congealing on the platter. It sounded like the end of the world. Rob didn't look at the food. He looked directly at Vance Sterling, the shark in the expensive suit, and gave a thin, predatory smile of his own. "Good afternoon, everyone." Rob said, his voice a low clinical growl that instantly shifted the gravity of the room. "I am Rob Morrison Silas's personal counsel and the secondary executor of the Maria Thorne Trust. Mr. Sterling, your due diligence is as thin as this gravy. This property isn't in probate. It's protected." Vance stammered for a second, his practiced composure slipping. "We are merely facilitating a transition agreement for Mr. Thorne's safety," he managed to say. Rob didn't let him finish. He systematically dismantled the room, pointing out that the property was held under an enhanced life estate deed. He explained that any attempt to coerce the life tenant was not only a civil violation, but a trigger for specific penal clauses left by Maria. "We're just looking out for his safety," Emily interjected, her voice rising in a desperate pitch. "Don't make this a courtroom battle." Rob ignored her, reaching into his portfolio. The room went so quiet I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Rob pulled out a certified copy of the Trust's Article 6 and began to read it aloud. He explained that by bringing a lawyer and a senior living representative to intimidate me, Emily and Brian had officially contested my peaceful possession of the home. This action triggered a forfeiture clause, subject to judicial enforcement of their $450,000 residual interest in the trust. Justice isn't a hammer. In this room, it was a slow-acting venom, and I was watching my daughter realize she'd already been bitten. Emily's face went a ghostly shade of white. $450,000, she whispered. "You're lying. That money is mine." Brian's jaw dropped, his opportunistic eyes darting around the room as if searching for an exit. "It's called a no contest clause," Emily, Rob said, his voice cold as a winter morning. "Your mother knew you'd come for the bricks, so she made the bricks the poison. The money will now be redirected to a veterans housing nonprofit." I watched the realization settle over them like a shroud. How much is a daughter's love worth when it's measured against $500,000 of her mother's dead hand control? Rob then revealed the mid-task twist the entire interaction had been recorded by the new camera system, and the footage had already been time-stamped and uploaded to a secure legal server as evidence of the forfeiture event. Vance Sterling didn't even wait for the dessert. He realized he was in the middle of a documented breach of trust and potential elder abuse litigation. "My firm doesn't handle forfeiture events, Emily," he said, snapping his laptop shut with a sound that felt like a gavel hitting wood. "You're on your own." The senior living representative followed him out, her white smile long gone. Brian and his parents began a loud, panicked argument at the table, their expected windfall evaporating into thin air. "Brian, the bank has already started the process on the condo," he muttered under his breath as he passed. The house was their only way to avoid homelessness. The vultures were fleeing, leaving a trail of broken promises and cold turkey behind them. Emily didn't apologize. She stood up, her face a mask of cold, sharp fury, and leaned over the table toward me, her eyes reflecting the harsh overhead light. "You think you won, Dad?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a redirected bitterness. "You just started a war you're too old to finish. We'll see how long you last in this mausoleum when you're legally declared unfit." She turned on her heel and marched out of the room, her designer heels clicking with a violent staccato rhythm. I stayed in my chair, the silence that followed the front door slam feeling like a physical weight. The sound of Emily's tires screeching out of the driveway left the house in a hollow, ringing silence. I looked at the lace tablecloth now stained with gravy and the debris of a family war and felt a strange, icy calm. I wasn't just defending a house anymore, I was surviving a demolition. Rob reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, Silas," he said quietly. I nodded, but the victory felt like it was made of glass. The daughter I raised had vanished, leaving only a stranger with a hardened stare, as the Redmonds' desperation was deeper than I had imagined. If they were facing foreclosure on their own home, they weren't going to stop. They were cornered, and a cornered predator is the most dangerous kind. I looked at Maria's portrait on the sideboard. She had seen this coming 12 years ago. She had built this legal fortress knowing her own daughter would be the one trying to scale the walls. I felt a surge of gratitude for her foresight, but it was overshadowed by the profound sorrow of a father who had just realized his child was truly gone. We stayed in the dining room for a long time, the only sound the wind rattling the window panes. I realized that the Thanksgiving feast was over, but the actual siege was only beginning. Emily's threat of a conservatorship wasn't a bluff. It was her last-ditch effort to salvage her own financial ruin. I was no longer a father to her. I was a target. But as I looked at the certified documents Rob had placed on the table, I knew I wasn't an easy mark. I had the law, I had the evidence, and I had the gold-threaded spirit of a man who wasn't ready to let the wolves win. The sound of Emily's tires screeching out of the driveway left the house in a hollow, ringing silence. I stood by the window, watching the red glow of her taillights vanish into the Portland mist, feeling the weight of the war she had just declared. The leftovers were still cold on the counter, a feast for a family that had cannibalized itself before the first slice of pie. The warmth in my daughter's eyes hadn't just cooled since she walked through the door. It had turned into a permafrost that threatened to crack the very foundation of my home. I walked back into the dining room, where the air still smelled of expensive perfume and desperate greed. Rob was already on his phone, his voice a low rhythmic hum, as he coordinated with his office. He looked at me, his expression a mix of professional steel and personal sorrow. "She's not going to stop Silas," he said. "You need to be ready for the next move." I nodded, the icy calm from the dinner table, still holding my spine straight. I spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance. The Monday morning after Thanksgiving brought the first strike. My phone rang at 8 a.m., and Emily's voice was as cold as a morgue slab. She didn't offer a greeting. She calmly informed me that she had filed a preliminary petition for an emergency conservatorship. She cited my recent erratic behavior regarding the utilities and my delusional reliance on Rob as proof that I was a danger to myself. I felt a spike of chilled dread. She was twisting the very evidence I had used to protect myself, the restoration of my own power and water, into a narrative of dementia. "You're not well, Dad," she said, her tone dripping with a rehearsed clinical pity. "Paranoid people see enemies in their own children. It's for your own safety." I gripped the receiver until my knuckles turned white. "I only see the enemies you've brought to my table, Emily," I replied. I hung up before she could respond, my pulse racing in sharp, uneven beats. My own daughter was using my heartbeat as a countdown timer. Following Rob's advice, I retreated to my study and glued my eyes to the security monitors. The grainy footage became my only window to the world. I watched Brian's black truck circle the block 4 times a day, a predator scenting the air. Once in the middle of a torrential downpour, I saw Emily's car parked at the end of the driveway. She just sat there, the wipers flicking back and forth, like a nervous tick watching the house. The psychological pressure began to fray my nerves. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the settling timber sounded like an intruder. How do you defend yourself against a lie that's dressed up in the language of love and concern late that Tuesday night? I was reviewing the 2 a.m. footage when I caught a flicker of movement near the back of the property. I zoomed in the infrared light, turning the garden into a ghostly green landscape. Brian was there meeting a man in a dark jumpsuit near the cellar door. I recognized the man. It was the same locksmith Brian had tried to hire before. They weren't looking at the front door this time. They were inspecting the old wooden cellar hatch I had forgotten to upgrade. I felt a surge of nausea. They were looking for a breach in the fortress. On Wednesday afternoon, a notification chime echoed through the silent study. I opened my laptop, the blue light hum filling the room, as I read an email with the subject line, "Final Notice." It wasn't from a bank or the utility company. It was from Emily. She gave me until Friday at noon to voluntarily relocate to the Wested Hills facility, or she would initiate all necessary steps to secure the property and my person. She claimed she had a court-authorized civil standby, ready to assist with the transition. The house didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a bunker with a glass ceiling. I realized this was the deadline for a physical takeover. I called Rob immediately, my voice trembling with a desperate resolve. "She's given me 48 hours to disappear from my own life, Rob," I said. Rob didn't hesitate. "Hold the line, Silas. Don't open the door for anyone but me. I'll be there by noon Friday with the paperwork that stops this cold." As I scrolled to the bottom of Emily's email, I saw an attachment titled "Signed Consent." I opened it and my breath stopped. It was a scanned document, a formal agreement to vacate the premises and enter the care facility. At the bottom was my signature. It was a blatant, poorly executed forgery, my name written in a hand that wasn't mine, the loops too wide and the pressure too light. My own child had signed my name to a death warrant. I stared at the forged signature on my screen, the white light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, and realized Emily wasn't just coming for my house, she was planning to replace my very existence with a paper ghost. She wanted to erase the man who had raised her and replace him with a compliant, silent victim who would sign away his soul just to stop the noise. I sat in the darkness of the study, the wind rattling the cellar door below, and felt the last shred of my hesitation dissolve. The girl I had carried on my shoulders was gone, replaced by a stranger who was willing to steal my very identity to pay for her husband's sins. Friday was coming, and I knew it wouldn't be a dinner. It would be a siege. The heavy hydraulic hiss of the moving truck's brakes sounded like a guillotine blade sliding into place, effectively severing my last hope that Emily wouldn't actually go through with it. I stood behind the sheer curtains of my living room, watching the massive white vehicle back into my gravel driveway, with a relentless beep, beep, beep that felt like a pulse monitor flatlining. It was exactly 9 o'clock on Friday morning. The Portland sky was a bruised purple, threatening a downpour that matched the storm brewing in my chest. I saw Brian hop out of the passenger side, gesturing wildly to a pair of men in stained jumpsuits. They weren't from any professional moving company I recognized. They looked like day laborers Brian had scrounged up from a street corner to avoid leaving a paper trail or paying for liability. I felt a surge of rising panic as the back door of the truck rolled open, revealing a cavernous, empty belly, waiting to be filled with the pieces of my life. I didn't open the door when the first heavy thud hit the porch. I waited until Emily stepped out of her car, clutching that folder of forged papers like a shield. When I finally swung the door open, the cold November air rushed in, smelling of diesel fumes and damp pavement. Emily walked past me, without looking me in the eye, her jaw set in a line of iron. "We're on a schedule, Dad," she said, her voice clinical and detached. "Just take your clothes and the basics. We'll handle the rest later." I stood my ground, my hand gripping the doorframe until the wood bit into my palm. "I am not a guest in a hotel, Emily. This is my home. You are trespassing on a life you didn't build." She didn't stop. She didn't even flinch. To the movers carrying empty cardboard boxes past me, I was just a confused senior being managed by a weary, dutiful daughter. Tape screeched against cardboard. It sounded like a scream. I followed her, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as she marched straight for the master bedroom. I felt the breach of the threshold like a physical wound. This was the room I had shared with Maria for 40 years, the one place where her scent still lingered in the grain of the floorboards. Emily began systematically emptying Maria's dresser, her movements jagged and disrespectful. She wasn't preserving a legacy. She was clearing a path. I watched her sweep Maria's silk scarves and lace handkerchiefs into a box with a callousness that felt like a physical assault. "These aren't yours anymore, Dad," she snapped when I tried to catch her wrist. "They're family property. I'm protecting them from your decline. Your mother wore that necklace to your graduation." I whispered, my voice thick with a helpless rage. "You're throwing it in a box like it's trash." When does a daughter become a stranger? Is it when she stops listening, or when she starts stealing? I realized then that I was witnessing the total desecration of a sanctuary. She moved to the vanity, her eyes scanning for anything of value. That was when she saw the velvet-lined jewelry box, the one I had cleaned every Tuesday since the funeral. I tried to reach for it to keep at least one thing sacred, but Emily was faster. She snatched it up her fingers, fumbling through the interior, until she found the one piece that mattered most: Maria's wedding ring. It was a simple gold band worn thin by 4 decades of devotion, but in that moment, it was the only sun in my universe. My heart felt like a dry leaf caught in a gale brittle and ready to shatter under the weight of her greed. I lunged forward, my fingers brushing the velvet, but Emily clamped her hand over the ring, pulling it against her chest. "I'm taking this for safekeeping," she hissed, her face contorting into something I didn't recognize. "You clearly can't be trusted with things of value anymore. Look at you, Silas. You're irrational. You're dangerous. Give it back, Emily." I begged, my dignity dissolving into a raw, agonizing plea. That ring never left her finger for 40 years. Please. She didn't even blink. She slipped the gold band into her coat pocket, refusing to meet my gaze as she checked her watch. "Your 3 hours are up," she said. "The locksmith is coming to the cellar door. Pack your bag or leave without it." I stood in the middle of the room, my wife's memory looted, and my own daughter standing over the remains like a victor. I felt a surge of absolute soul-crushing betrayal. I looked out the bedroom window and saw Brian standing near the back of the house. He was handing a wad of cash to a man with a tool belt, pointing toward the old wooden cellar hatch I had forgotten to secure. They were bypassing the deadbolts, moving for the one weak point in the fortress, while Emily kept me occupied with her theft. Emily clutched the wedding ring to her chest through the fabric of her coat, her eyes as cold as the gold in her hand. And for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't looking at my child, but at a predator who had finally found the kill. The house felt like it was shrinking, the walls vibrating with the heavy footsteps of the men carrying my furniture toward the hydraulic hiss of the truck. I was being erased box by box, and the only person who could stop the clock was miles away in a courtroom. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress sagging under the weight of my defeat, and listened to the sound of porcelain hitting the floor in the kitchen. My world was shattering, and I was the only one left to hear the noise. The shattered remains of 1983 lay across my floor like bone fragments, a jagged punctuation to the looting taking place in my own home. Adria Redmond didn't even look up from her inventory as I entered, the phantom weight of Maria's ring still burning against my empty palm. My kitchen, once a private sanctuary of 40 years, was now being audited by a stranger with the clinical indifference of an auctioneer, my legs feeling like brittle stalks of dry corn. And watched Adria Redmond. She was busying herself at my counters, humming a tune that sounded far too cheerful for a morning defined by theft. She had already cleared 3 of my upper cabinets, stacking my life's collection of plates onto the breakfast table. I saw the box she was working from, a set of modern, sterile white dishes that looked like they belonged in a cheap hotel. That was from our first dinner together. I managed to say, my voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. I pointed to the hand-painted plate she was currently holding, a piece Maria and I had bought in a small shop in 1983. "It's irreplaceable." Adria didn't even look at me. She just gave a dismissive flick of her wrist, and the plate slipped. I watched in slow-motion horror as it hit the hardwood. The porcelain didn't just break, it exploded. 40 years of memory turned into white dust on the floor. "It's just a chip, Silas," she said, though the plate was in 20 pieces. "You're being dramatic. These cupboards need a fresh start." As I looked down at the wreckage, I noticed a roll of small red stickers sitting next to her handbag. My eyes traveled to the hutch. Maria's crystal vase had one. The antique silver serving tray had another. I realized then that Adria wasn't just modernizing the kitchen. She was tagging specific items with red stickers for a liquidation auction she had already scheduled for Monday. They weren't just moving me out. They were selling my life piece by piece before I was even out the door. I turned away the sight of those red dots burning into my retinas like miniature suns. I made my way to the hallway, fumbling in my pocket for my phone. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped it twice. I dialed Rob Morrison, praying for the sound of a voice that didn't want to sell my soul for a commission. It went straight to voicemail. "Rob, if you're there, they're taking the furniture. They're taking everything," I whispered into the receiver. I hung up and stared at the dark screen. The notice to vacate paper Emily had shoved into my hand earlier sat on the granite counter like a death warrant. I felt a terrifying sense of abandonment wash over me, a cold draft that seemed to come from the very walls I had built. I was just an old man shouting at a storm, and the storm didn't care about my history or my heart. How do you beg for mercy from people who have already priced your life by the square foot? I could hear the heavy thuds from the front of the house, the sound of my favorite armchair. The one where I had read to Emily when she was a toddler being dragged toward the curb. I moved toward the foyer, but my path was blocked. Two of the men Brian had hired stood in the hallway, their arms crossed, their expressions vacant and bored. They didn't say a word. They just existed as a physical wall between me and my belongings. I saw Brian near the front door talking to a man in a stained work shirt with a heavy tool belt. The locksmith looked at the job with the bored indifference of someone who didn't care whose lives were being locked out as long as the check cleared. He was already unpacking his kit, the clink of metal tools sounding like the clicking of a predator's teeth. "Almost done, mister." Redmond, the locksmith, said, his voice echoing in the increasingly empty foyer. "New cylinders are ready." Brian nodded, a smug, localized victory written across his features. "Good. Let's get the old man's bags on the porch." I stood there trapped in the center of my own home, watching the mechanics of my exile. The high-pitched whine of the power drill started up a sound that signaled the finality of my exclusion. It was a clinical mechanical noise, the sound of my life being rekeyed to a stranger's benefit. I had less than 15 minutes before my keys became useless pieces of brass. The locksmith's drill was a cicada of doom, singing the song of my own house, turning its back on me. I felt the last of my resolve beginning to liquefy. I looked at the open front door, the cold Portland air rushing in and chilling the sweat on my neck. I could see the moving truck idling, its exhaust plumes rising like ghosts in the gray light. I was losing. I had the law on my side, I had the truth on my side, but none of that mattered against the brute force of a drill and a daughter who had forgotten who I was. I closed my eyes, waiting for the final click of the new lock, the sound that would officially make me a trespasser in the only place I belonged. But then, through the whine of the drill and the barked orders of the movers, I heard something else. It was the screech of tires on the gravel driveway, a violent, hurried sound that didn't belong to a moving truck. I opened my eyes and looked past the men in the hallway. A black sedan had swerved into the drive, pinning the moving truck in place. I recognized the car instantly. It was Rob, and behind him, a second car was pulling in the driver, already stepping out with a camera held high. The drill bit touched the brass of my deadbolt, but the sound of Rob Morrison's car door slamming sounded like the first shot of a counteroffensive. I felt a sudden electric jolt of hope. The siege wasn't over. The strategist had finally arrived at the front lines. Rob didn't just walk up the steps. He stormed them like an invading army, his smartphone held out like evidence he was ready to put on record. He was recording everything, his thumb steady on the screen, while his other hand clutched a leather portfolio that looked like a shield. I stood on the threshold, my breath hitching, as I watched the locksmith freeze his power drill, still humming against the brass of my deadbolt. Rob's voice cut through the air sharp and controlled through the porch and down into the street. "You touch that lock again, and I'll have your license in your shop by Monday morning," he barked. "I am Rob Morrison, legal counsel for Silas Thorne, and the executor of the Maria Thorne Trust. This is an illegal eviction in progress, and you are currently being recorded as a primary accomplice." The locksmith froze, glancing between Rob and the officers before slowly stepping back, clearly realizing he was in over his head. He didn't even stop to pick up a stray wrench, simply scrambling to his van while Brian Redmond stood there, his face turning a mottled, desperate red. "This is a family matter, Rob." "Get that camera out of my face," Brian screamed, but his voice lacked its usual predatory weight. It sounded thin like a wire about to snap. Rob didn't flinch. He turned the camera toward Brian and then Emily, who was standing by the moving truck with my wife's jewelry box still clutched in her hands. That's when it hit me, Rob hadn't come alone. From the second car, a man in a dark suit stepped out, a private security guard, who took a position at the edge of the lawn. Rob leaned in close to Brian, his voice dropping to a low clinical growl. I've already filed for a restraining order, pending judicial approval, and as the legal owner, my client remains the sole lawful occupant unless a court rules otherwise. If you don't start moving that furniture back inside, you're going to be talking to the district attorney by sundown. The room fell into a suffocating silence, thick enough to press against my ears. Just as Brian opened his mouth to retaliate, the strobe-like flash of blue and red lights began to dance against the craftsman wood of the porch. 2 Portland police cruisers pulled into the driveway, summoned by Rob's earlier report of elder abuse in progress. 2 officers, their faces set in the grim, professional masks of those who deal with family wars daily, stepped onto the lawn with their hands resting near their belts. Rob met them halfway, presenting the deed, the trust documents, and the restraining order application with the practiced efficiency of a man who had won 1,000 courtroom battles. After several tense minutes reviewing the documents and speaking with both sides, they looked at the boxes on the lawn, the locksmith's abandoned kit, and Emily's trembling hands. The lead officer turned to Emily. "Ma'am, do you have a court order for this removal?" When she stammered, his expression didn't change. "Then you are trespassing. You and your crew need to put everything back exactly where you found it, now." Breathing in that moment felt unnatural, like the house itself was rejecting what had just happened. I watched as the movers, sensing the shift in power, began hauling my favorite armchair back toward the front door. The sound of heavy furniture being dragged back across the floor was a dull, repetitive thud that slowly brought life back into the room. "Dad, tell them it's a mistake," Emily pleaded, her voice high and shaky. "We were just trying to help you. We thought you weren't thinking clearly." Rob stepped between us. "Officer," he said, pointing to Emily's coat. "The woman in the designer heels currently has her mother's wedding ring in her pocket. That is theft. She snatched it from his hand less than an hour ago." The confrontation escalated the moment Rob's sedan pinned the moving truck against the curb. He didn't repeat his earlier warnings. He acted. With his phone recording every flinch, Rob marched straight to the officers now arriving on the scene, bypassing the panicked locksmith entirely. "Officer, this isn't a family dispute," Rob stated, his voice steady, cutting cleanly through Brian's shouting. "This is a documented breach of a life estate. Every item currently on that lawn is evidence of grand larceny." Follow, the locksmith, realizing the legal buzzsaw he'd just stepped into, didn't wait for a second warning. He threw his tools into his van and sped away, leaving the front door half dismantled and the Redmonds exposed. The visual of that ring, the one Maria wore for 40 years, sitting in a plastic evidence bag, made my heart shatter all over again. As the officers documented the property damage in the kitchen, specifically the broken shards of the 1983 Thanksgiving plate, the lead officer pulled me aside. He spoke quietly, his voice devoid of the clinical edge he used with Brian. "Mr. Thorne, there appears to be sufficient grounds to investigate potential forgery theft and unlawful entry. It's up to you if you want to file a formal complaint. If you don't, they walk. If you do, they may be detained pending further investigation." I looked at Emily. She finally looked small, her designer polish stripped away by the blue and red lights. She looked like the child she used to be, but the eyes were still the eyes of the person who had tried to bury me alive. I looked at the chipped porcelain in my hand, the remains of the first meal Maria and I ever shared in this house. Pressing charges didn't feel like a victory. It felt like pulling the plug on a ghost that had been haunting me for years. "If I don't stop you now, Emily, you'll spend the rest of my life trying to bury me," I said, my voice gravelly and firm. "Yes, officer, all charges, every single one." I saw the officer nod, and then he turned back to Brian. While being frisked, Brian was found to be carrying a notice of foreclosure for his and Emily's condo in his back pocket. The house wasn't just a want. They were hours away from being homeless themselves. The desperation I had felt in them wasn't just greed. It was the frantic scratching of people drowning. I watched the handcuffs click shut around Emily's wrists, the same wrists I used to lift her by when she was a toddler, and I realized the daughter I loved had been gone long before the police arrived. The house was mine again, but it had never felt more empty. The quiet that rushed back into the house after the sirens faded wasn't the peace I'd been praying for. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a graveyard where only one person was left to tend the stones. I stood in my foyer, my hands still tingling from the phantom vibration of the adrenaline that had sustained me through the siege. The blue and red lights had vanished from the walls, leaving behind the dull, honest glow of my lamps, and a house that felt physically bruised. Boxes were half unpacked, their cardboard flaps gaping open like mouths frozen mid-scream. The furniture was slightly out of alignment, each piece shifted just enough to make the room feel unfamiliar, as if I were standing in a parallel version of my own home. The air still held the sharp metallic tang of the locksmith's drill, a scent that reminded me of blood and machinery. I was legally secure the deadbolt was firm, and the intruders were gone, yet I felt a profound sense of hollowness. The victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival, raw, exhausting, and strangely empty. I walked into the kitchen, my gaze falling on the wreckage Adria had left behind. The shards of the 1983 Thanksgiving plate were scattered across the hardwood, like bone fragments, each piece catching the overhead light and throwing tiny, jagged reflections onto the cabinets. It was a small thing in the face of grand larceny and forgery, but it was the one piece of my history that couldn't be replaced by a court order. Maria and I had bought that plate in a little shop in Cannon Beach on our first anniversary, back when we were young enough to think that 40 years together was an eternity we couldn't yet imagine. Now it was dust destroyed by a woman who didn't even know what she was breaking. I sat at the table staring at the porcelain until Rob walked back in carrying a small wooden box he'd retrieved from his car. He didn't offer platitudes about family or moving on. Rob had always been a man of action, not words, and for that I was grateful. Instead, he set the box down on the table with a soft thud and opened it to reveal a small kit containing gold-dusted lacquer, tiny brushes with bristles so fine they looked like they belonged in a surgical theater, and a set of tweezers that gleamed under the kitchen light. He told me about kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery, by mending the areas of breakage with gold. The philosophy was simple. He explained, his voice taking on the cadence of a teacher. The break is part of the history, not something to be disguised. The cracks become the most beautiful part of the piece, a testament to what it survived. You don't hide the damage, Thane, he said, his voice low and steady, the same tone he used in courtrooms when he was building toward a closing argument. You highlight it. You make it stronger and more beautiful because it survived. This plate broke, but it doesn't have to stay broken. And neither do you. I spent the rest of that night meticulously piecing the porcelain back together. My hands haven't been this steady since the day I designed my first jet engine, back when precision wasn't just a skill, but a matter of life and death. I laid out the shards on a clean towel, organizing them by size and curve, reconstructing the puzzle of what had once been whole. Each piece fit into the next, with a satisfying click, the edges rough and unforgiving, but findable if you had patience. As I applied the gold-dusted resin to the jagged edges, I realized that kintsugi is the gold-threaded scar on a life that refused to stay broken. My relationship with Emily was a pile of dust scattered and irretrievable, but my own spirit was being mended with the gold of my integrity. Each vein of lacquer I painted became a map of what I had endured: the Thanksgiving ambush, the 3-hour siege, the theft of Maria's ring, and the moment I had watched my daughter led away in handcuffs. By dawn, the plate sat whole on the table, the bright gold veins mapping out the trauma of the previous day, turning a symbol of destruction into a monument of resilience. I held it up to the morning light streaming through the bay window, and the gold glowed as if it were alive. It was no longer the plate Maria and I had bought in Cannon Beach. It was something new, something that carried its history on its surface for anyone to see. The clinical reality of the legal system caught up with me a few weeks later in a Portland courtroom. I sat behind the petitioner's table, the cold, polished marble of the floor, leaching the warmth from my shoes. The room smelled of old wood and institutional disinfectant, a scent that seemed designed to strip away emotion and leave only facts. Rob sat beside me, his leather portfolio open, his presence a silent wall against the chaos. He had dressed in his courtroom, best a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than my first car, a silk tie the color of dried blood, and cufflinks that caught the fluorescent light. When Emily was led in, I felt a sharp, involuntary pang in my chest. She was stripped of her pharmaceutical sales rep polish, her hair unwashed and pulled back in a limp ponytail, and her eyes rimmed with the red fatigue of someone who had finally run out of lies. She wore an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on her frame, and her wrists bore the faint marks where the handcuffs had rubbed during her transport. She looked tired and broken, and for a fleeting second my paternal instinct screamed at me to protect her. But then I remembered the weight of her hand as she snatched Maria's ring from the jewelry box, and I remained silent. I watched Judge Sterling, a woman with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen every version of family betrayal Portland had to offer, take the bench. The judge's gavel hit the wood. Bang! The sound of a door locking from the inside. The courtroom went silent, the kind of absolute quiet that feels like pressure against your eardrums. The district attorney began reading the list of felonies: forgery, grand larceny, and elder abuse. Each charge was read aloud with the dispassionate efficiency of someone reciting a grocery list, but the words landed like hammer blows. During the reading, a secondary truth emerged that chilled the room. Emily's own employer had already moved to terminate her after seeing the police report and the forged documents. She had lost the very career she had used as a weapon against me. The DA presented a letter from the pharmaceutical company formally severing all ties and noting that Emily's security clearance had been revoked, pending the outcome of the criminal trial. Based on the video evidence and the verified forgery, the court finds a substantial threat to the petitioner's safety. Judge Sterling announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. The defendant's actions demonstrate a pattern of predatory behavior targeting a vulnerable elder, and the evidence of premeditation is overwhelming. I leaned toward Rob, my voice a mere whisper. I didn't want this for her, Rob, but I couldn't survive her anymore. Rob didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the judge, but his hand found my forearm and squeezed once, a silent acknowledgement that sometimes survival requires actions that feel like cruelty. The hearing moved with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a machine I had lost control of. Justice is a necessary thing, but I wondered, is justice supposed to taste this much like ashes, or am I just not used to the flavor of a clean sweep? The final blow came when the bailiff handed over a status report on Brian. My son-in-law hadn't even shown up. The report stated that Brian had skipped bail and fled the state, leaving Emily to face the criminal charges and the impending foreclosure of their condo entirely alone. The predator had abandoned his partner the moment the trap snapped shut. He had taken what little liquid assets remained and vanished, leaving behind a forwarding address that turned out to be a motel in Nevada that had burned down 3 years ago. Judge Sterling didn't hesitate in granting the final 5-year restraining order, prohibiting both Emily and Brian from coming within 500 feet of me or my property. I watched the bailiff hand Emily the papers, a physical barrier of white pulp and black ink now existing where a blood bond used to be. She looked at me, then her face contorting into a mask of pure crystalline bitterness, her lips pulling back from her teeth in something that wasn't quite a snarl, but wasn't far from it. "You're a cold man, Dad," she spat, her voice carrying across the quiet courtroom. "You always were. You never loved me. You loved your house more than you ever loved your own daughter." I didn't answer. The words hung in the air, accusatory and final, but I had nothing left to say. I stood up and followed Rob out of the room, the rhythmic hollow sound of the judge's gavel for the next case already beginning behind us. A reminder that the world moved on, whether you were ready or not. I walked out of the courthouse and onto the wide stone steps, the sharp, dry January wind hitting my face with a shock of reality. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of winter and the distant hint of snow from the mountains. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange light sensation in my chest that I realized was the first true breath of a new life. I stood on the courthouse steps, the gold-repaired plate waiting for me on my kitchen shelf, and wondered if the veterans Maria wanted to help would ever know that their new roof was paid for by my daughter's greed. The pen felt surprisingly light in my hand as I signed away $450,000 of blood money, turning a daughter's betrayal into a soldier's sanctuary. I sat in my study the late February sun, casting long, pale fingers across the surface of my mahogany desk, each beam of light cutting through the dust motes that hung suspended in the air like tiny, drifting stars. The scratch of the expensive fountain pen on the thick bond paper was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic, satisfying rasp that felt like the final suture on a wound that had been open for too long. Each stroke of ink was deliberate, the letters of my name forming with the same precision I had once used to sign off on jet engine specifications that would carry hundreds of souls through the sky. Beside me stood Rob Morrison, and a man who represented the best of what Maria had always hoped for. Marcus Turner, a soft-spoken veteran with a prosthetic leg and a smile that seemed to have been earned in harder places than this, accepted the folder with trembling gratitude. His hands shook slightly as he took the papers, and I noticed the way his fingers lingered on the embossed seal, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was holding. He was the director of the Portland Veterans Housing and Elder Advocacy Fund, and he looked at the trust transfer documents as if they were a lifeline cast into a stormy sea. "Mr. Garrison, this will provide housing for 22 veterans," he said, his voice thick with emotion that he didn't try to hide. "It's a miracle. We've been waiting for funding like this for 3 years. 22 men and women who served their country will have a roof over their heads because of your wife's foresight and your generosity." I looked at the framed photo of Maria on my desk, her eyes bright with the same compassion that had driven her to volunteer at the shelter for 12 years. "She always said that money should build things, not burn them down," I replied, my voice catching slightly on the past tense. "She would have wanted it this way. She always did." Marcus informed me that they intended to name the new community room Maria's Place, a dedication that would be engraved on a bronze plaque at the entrance. The words would read, "In memory of Maria Garrison, who believed every soul deserved a home." I felt a surge of quiet pride, a poetic closure to the 12-year-old plan she had set in motion while she was still breathing. While I had lost the daughter I raised, I had finally fulfilled my wife's highest moral purpose. The money Emily had tried to steal would now house the homeless, feed the hungry, and provide dignity to those who had sacrificed everything. It was in that moment I discovered another layer to her foresight. As Rob reviewed the secondary files, spreading them across the desk, with the methodical care of a surgeon, he pointed out that Maria had established a smaller, separate, and completely untouchable trust for our grandchildren's education. The document was dated the same day as the enhanced life estate deed, hidden in plain sight among the estate papers. Even the forfeiture clause couldn't trigger it. She had ensured the boys wouldn't be punished for their parents' sins. Leo and his younger brother would still have college funds, still have a future, even if their mother had lost everything. The ink on the transfer papers was the only blood I was willing to spill to keep this house standing. I looked at the signature, my name in black fountain pen ink still wet and glistening, and felt a strange sense of completion. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A few weeks later, in the cold gray light of March, Rob visited me in my workshop for what he called a fallout report. The Portland rain drummed against the roof of the detached garage with a steady hypnotic rhythm, and the air smelled of cedar shavings and machine oil. I was working on a cedar birdhouse for Leo's 9th birthday, the smell of sawdust and fresh wood acting as an anchor for my thoughts. The wood was smooth under my hands, the grain running in long, elegant lines that reminded me of Maria's handwriting. Rob leaned against the workbench, his expression uncharacteristically somber, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like pity. "The condo is gone, Thane," he said, without preamble. "Brian took what was left of the liquid assets and vanished before the warrant could be served. Emily officially finalized the divorce last week. She signed the papers at the county clerk's office alone. No lawyer, no witnesses except the notary." I stopped my sanding the wood, feeling rough under my palm, the 80 grit sandpaper suddenly abrasive against my skin. Brian was a ghost now, a fugitive ghost with a gambling debt that the state of Oregon didn't intend to forget. Somewhere out there he was running, always looking over his shoulder, always one step ahead of the creditors and the law. Rob continued explaining that Emily was now unemployed, her professional reputation in tatters, and was living in a small studio apartment in the Lentz neighborhood across the city. She had hit absolute rock bottom, stripped of the designer heels and pharmaceutical sales rep polish she had used as armor. She was working 2 retail jobs, one at a grocery store, one at a big box hardware chain, earning minimum wage and paying back the restitution for the broken china and the moving company out of her own pocket dollar by hard-earned dollar. I didn't want her to starve Rob. I said, my heart heavy with a melancholy I couldn't quite shake. I just wanted her to stop. There's a difference between justice and cruelty, and I never wanted to cross that line. Rob nodded, slowly understanding the distinction without needing further explanation. I remained firm on the boundaries of the restraining order, knowing that any crack in the wall would only invite the predator back in. But I also made it clear to Rob that if Emily needed emergency help, medical bills, a safe place to stay, he was authorized to provide it discreetly without her knowing the source. Mercy didn't require proximity. By the time April arrived, Maria's garden began to bloom with a ferocity that felt like a deliberate sign from the earth itself. The damp earth smelled of rebirth petrichor, mixed with the sweet green scent of new growth, and the budding roses were pushing through the soil like green spears of defiance. I spent my mornings tending to the crocuses and daffodils, using the quiet manual labor to process the final dregs of my grief. The physical act of digging, weeding, and watering was meditative, a prayer spoken in the language of soil and sweat. I found myself back in the workshop using the very tools Brian had once tried to pawn to build something new. The steady rhythm of the hammer hitting the cedar was therapeutic, a craftsmanship I thought I had lost during the siege. Each strike was a heartbeat, each measurement a promise that I was still capable of creating beauty in a world that had tried to strip me of everything. Can a garden grow back after a winter that lasted 12 years? Or do some things just stay frozen forever? I asked the question aloud, my voice carrying across the empty yard. The roses didn't answer, but they didn't need to. They were already blooming. I realized the house was no longer a battlefield. It was a living thing that was healing alongside me. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was simply space to breathe, space to think, space to decide what came next. You were right, Maria, I whispered to the wind as I tied a climbing rose to the trellis. The roses just needed a little more time and a lot less noise. I felt the first true sense of peace since the first doorbell rang on that fateful Thanksgiving. On a Tuesday morning, while the sun was still burning off the morning dew, I noticed the mail carrier lingering at my box longer than usual. I walked down the gravel drive, my boots crunching in the familiar rhythm I had walked 1,000 times before. As I reached the fence line, my foot caught on something buried in the dirt. I knelt and pulled a small, weathered plastic bag from the earth, the plastic cloudy with age and soil. Inside were the original keys Brian's father had used, hidden there, in a moment of panic when the sirens had first appeared, a failed escape plan abandoned in the chaos. I held the cold, grimy metal in my palm, a final relic of the invasion. The keys felt heavier than they should, as if they carried the weight of every lie, every manipulation, every desperate attempt to steal what was mine. I looked up and saw the mail carrier pulling away, leaving a single envelope in the box. It had no return address, just a child's shaky handwriting that I recognized instantly. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for it, the future suddenly feeling less certain and infinitely more hopeful. I didn't open it at the curb. I walked back to the house, past the rose bushes that were finally showing their first buds of the season, their tight green fists promising the pink and white blooms Maria had always tended with such care. The gravel crunched under my boots with a familiar grounding rhythm, and I sat at the kitchen table beneath the kintsugi plate I had mended. The gold veins caught the morning light streaming through the bay window, turning the fractures into something that looked less like damage and more like a roadmap of survival. My fingers were far less steady now than they had been when I was applying gold lacquer to porcelain. The envelope trembled in my grip, the childish handwriting on the front blurring slightly as I blinked against the sudden heat behind my eyes. I opened the birthday card from Leo, my grandson expecting a standard Hallmark sentiment, something mass-produced and cheerful, the kind of generic well-wishes that filled the aisles of drugstores. Instead, I found a hand-drawn picture of the birdhouse we had once built together in my workshop, the colors vibrant and messy in the way only a child's art can be. The roof was crooked, the nails drawn as exaggerated black dots, and there were birds, 3 of them flying out of the entrance hole with wings that looked more like starfish than feathers. A simple note was written inside in the careful oversized letters of someone who was still learning to control a pencil. I miss you, Grandpa. I love you. The words hit me like a physical blow, a punch to the solar plexus that knocked the air out of my lungs. More surprisingly, the $50 bill I had mailed months ago was taped to the inside flap, the edges worn soft from handling. Beside it was a second note written on a piece of lined school paper, with the faint blue ruling that reminded me of my own elementary school days. It said in what I recognized as a teacher's neat script, translating Leo's dictation, that he didn't want the money. He just wanted his teacher to help him find the right mailbox, so I would know he hadn't forgotten. The $50 bill fell to the floor, fluttering down in a slow, lazy arc that seemed to take forever. Even a child knew some things couldn't be bought back. I stared at the green paper on the hardwood, Andrew Jackson's stern face looking up at me like an accusation. And I realized then that despite the Redmonds' best efforts to erase me from the boys' lives, my legacy lived on in a small boy's memory. It wasn't the house or the trust that mattered. It was the time spent in the sawdust of the workshop teaching him how to measure twice and cut once, how to sand with the grain, how to be patient with wood, because it would teach you patience in return. I sat there for a long time, the stillness of the house finally feeling like peace rather than a void. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall marked the passage of minutes, but I didn't move. I just held the card tracing the crayon lines of the birdhouse, with my thumb feeling the slight indentations where Leo had pressed too hard in his enthusiasm. After a while, I walked into my study and looked at the unopened stack of letters sitting in the bottom drawer of my desk. There were 15 in total, all sent through Rob's office over the last several months. They were thick-heavy with pages I hadn't been able to bring myself to read. The envelopes varied in thickness. Some were slim, perhaps a single page of apology, while others bulged with what must have been longer confessions or explanations. I wasn't ready to let Emily's voice back into my head, not yet. The wound was still too fresh, the scar tissue still pink and tender. But as I held Leo's card, I realized that the wall I had built to survive was now the only thing keeping me from the possibility of a future. The fortress I had constructed out of restraining orders and security cameras had done its job. It had kept me safe. But safety, I was beginning to understand, could also be a kind of prison if you stayed locked inside long after the threat had passed. My phone rang, breaking the quiet with a shrill electronic buzz that made me jump. It was Rob Morrison. "Thane, I have a development," he said, his voice carrying that familiar authoritative weight that came from decades of arguing in front of judges. "Emily has filed a formal motion to modify the restraining order. She's requesting a single supervised in-person meeting." I gripped the phone, a cold spike of hesitation blooming in my gut, like frost spreading across a window pane. The idea of seeing her face to face made my chest tighten, with a complex mixture of dread and something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. She claims she's completed her initial therapy and restitution requirements. Rob continued, and I could hear the rustle of papers on his end. She says she has some items to return that never belonged in a box. Personal effects from Maria, I'm guessing. Things she shouldn't have taken in the first place. I looked at the stack of letters, their edges visible in the half-open drawer. "She's persistent, Thane. 15 letters and now a legal motion. Do you want to see her?" I closed my eyes, the image of her face at the Thanksgiving ambush, still vivid, the practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes, the cold calculation as she slid that quit-claim deed across my table. But then another image surfaced, Emily, at 5 years old, sitting on my shoulders at the Rose Festival parade, her hands tangled in my hair, shrieking with delight at the marching bands. "I don't know if I can look at her without seeing the handcuffs, Rob," I replied, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "How do you count the days until you have to face the person who tried to bury you alive?" Rob was silent for a moment, and I could picture him in his office leaning back in his leather chair, weighing his words with the precision of a man who understood that language could heal or wound. "You don't count the days, Thane. You just decide if you're ready to find out who she is now. Not who she was, but who she's trying to become. That's the only question that matters." I eventually agreed, but only on my terms. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning in September, a year since the world had fallen apart. I spent the morning meticulously preparing the porch, sweeping the steps, checking the railing for loose boards, arranging the 2 chairs with the precision of a man setting up a chessboard. I didn't want her inside the house. That sanctuary was still too sacred, too fragile. But I wanted her to see that the house was still standing. I placed Maria's kintsugi repaired plate on the small table in the breakfast nook, positioned so it was visible through the front window. It was a silent testament to survival, a message that said, "I broke but I mended. I'm still here." As the designated time arrived, I saw a modest car pull up to the curb. It wasn't the luxury sedan Brian had driven with its gleaming paint and aggressive grille. This was a 10-year-old Honda with a dent in the passenger door and a faded bumper sticker that I couldn't quite read from this distance. Emily stepped out, and for a moment I didn't recognize her. She looked drastically different. She was thinner, her frame almost gaunt. Her hair pulled back in a simple knot instead of the expensive salon styling she used to favor. She was stripped of the predatory pharmaceutical sales rep polish that had once defined her. She wore worn-out sneakers jeans that looked like they'd seen 100 washings and a simple cardigan that hung loose on her shoulders. Her posture was humbled in a way that made my breath catch shoulders, slightly hunched head down, moving with the careful uncertainty of someone who had learned that the ground could give way without warning. The distance between the curb and my front porch felt like 1,000 miles of broken glass. I felt a surge of old parental instinct, warring with the cold iron of my boundaries. Part of me wanted to run down those steps and pull her into my arms to tell her everything was forgiven and we could start over. But another part, the part that had spent a year rebuilding itself, knew that forgiveness wasn't something you could rush and trust, was something that had to be earned back brick by brick. She walked slowly, her eyes fixed on the steps as if counting each one. Rob was already there, standing near the railing. As the court-appointed supervisor, his presence a reminder that this wasn't a family reunion. It was a legal proceeding. "You stay on the steps, Emily," I said as she reached the bottom, my voice coming out firmer than I felt. "That's the arrangement." She stopped, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, in a gesture that reminded me suddenly of a child called before the principal. "I know, Dad," she said, her voice small and rough, the confident pitch of the sales rep completely gone. "I'm just grateful you didn't say no." I noticed then that Rob had shared a detail I hadn't known. Emily had been working 2 retail jobs for the last 8 months, refusing to use any of the trust money she knew was gone. She was paying back the restitution for the broken china and the movers out of her own pocket dollar by hard-earned dollar. She wasn't asking for mercy yet. She was earning it. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small weathered velvet box, the one that had held Maria's wedding ring. A tight pressure built in my chest as I looked at that box, the same one she had snatched from my hand a year ago during the 3-hour takeover. It felt like a lifetime had passed since that moment in the bedroom, since I had watched her pocket my wife's memory, like it was just another asset to be liquidated. Emily stopped at the top step, her hands trembling as she held out the velvet box, her eyes searching mine for a father she had tried to erase, but finally seemed to have found. I stood behind the screen door, the scent of Maria's garden, roses heavy in the September air, and I realized that the girl who had declared war on me was truly gone. What stood in her place was a woman who was finally carrying the weight of her own choices. I reached out my hand, touching the cold mesh of the screen, and for the first time in a year, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like the man who owned the house. The velvet of the jewelry box was worn thin at the corners, much like the woman holding it, but when I took it from her, the weight of the gold inside felt like it could drop us both through the floorboards. I felt the sound of the velvet box clicking open in the quiet of the morning, a small mechanical snap that signaled the return of my wife's spirit to its rightful place. I looked down at Maria's wedding ring, the simple gold band catching the soft September light. It was cold against my skin, a physical anchor to a life I had spent a year fighting to reclaim. The metal seemed to hum with the memory of 40 years on her finger, the worn smooth surface reflecting the sunrise in a way that made my throat tighten. Emily stood 2 steps below me, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were as white as the paint on the porch railing. She didn't beg. For the first time in her life, Emily just told the truth. Her voice was a ragged whisper that carried more weight than any of her polished sales pitches ever had. The woman standing before me wasn't the pharmaceutical representative who had brought a lawyer to my Thanksgiving table. She was stripped of the designer heels and the practiced smile, replaced by worn sneakers and a vulnerability that looked like it had been earned through 8 months of hard labor and harder truths. "I didn't just want the house. Dad," she said, her eyes welling, with a shame that looked ancient. "I wanted to believe you were already gone, so I wouldn't have to feel the guilt of what I was doing. Brian made it sound like a math problem, but I was the one who signed the papers. I was the one who looked at you like you were a problem to be solved. I was the one who took Mom's ring and told myself it was for safekeeping, when I knew I was just stealing the last piece of her you had left." Her voice broke on the word, stealing the syllable, fragmenting like glass hitting concrete. I watched a single tear track down her cheek, cutting a clean line through the exhaustion etched into her face. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, a small act of surrender that told me more than any apology could. I listened with a clinical quiet intensity, my engineer's mind weighing her words for structural integrity. I had spent 40 years designing systems that couldn't fail, analyzing stress points and calculating tolerances. Now, I was applying that same rigor to my own daughter, searching for cracks in her confessions, testing, to see if this remorse was load-bearing or just another facade painted over rot. I saw the raw, painful catharsis in her face, a total collapse of the predator I had seen a year ago. She reached into her bag and produced a small handwritten ledger. The notebook was the kind you could buy at any dollar store, the cover bent and stained with coffee rings, and the smudges of countless handlings. I opened it slowly, the pages crackling with the dry sound of paper that had been written on with a heavy hand. Column after column of entries filled the lines, dates, hours worked, wages earned. I recognized the names of 2 retail chains where she had been stocking shelves and running registers, the kinds of jobs that paid minimum wage and demanded maximum humility. I opened the box to find not just the ring, but this notebook, a record of every dollar she had earned at her retail jobs. Over the last 8 months, Emily said, her voice steadying with a quiet pride. It was a rebuilding fund, she explained, intended for the Veterans Housing Project to replace the money she had tried to steal. I know I can never give back what the forfeiture clause took, but Marcus at the housing fund said even small donations matter. I've saved $2,347 so far. It's not much, but it's honest. The number sat in the air between us, like a monument. $2,347. At minimum wage that represented hundreds of hours of standing, lifting, smiling at strangers, and swallowing the bitter pill of a life reduced to survival. I thought about the condo she had lost, the career that had evaporated, and the husband who had fled the state. Emily had been left holding the bag, and instead of running, she had stayed and started filling it with pennies. Is it possible to love the person someone used to be, while still fearing the person they became? I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the gold-threaded cracks in her own soul. She had been broken by her own choices, shattered by the weight of Brian's debts, and the pressure of in-laws who saw her only as a means to an end. But here she stood, mended not with the invisible glue of denial, but with the honest repair of hard work and public shame. When you can face your mother's memory without flinching, Emily maybe, then we can talk about dinner, I said. My voice was gravelly, the words coming out slower than I intended. It wasn't a forgiveness, but it was a bridge, a narrow, fragile thing stretched across a chasm that still felt too wide to cross without looking down. She nodded, accepted the boundary, and walked back to her car. I watched her go, not with the rage of a victim, but with the weary peace of a survivor. Her shoulders were hunched, but there was something else too, a straightness to her spine that hadn't been there before. She had learned how to carry her own mistakes, and that knowledge was a kind of strength I hadn't expected to see. I retreated into the house, the rooms no longer feeling like a graveyard, but like a clean workshop waiting for a new project. I walked through the living room past the kintsugi plate sitting whole and proud on the shelf, and into my study. The plate caught my eye as I passed the gold veins catching the morning light, and glowing like circuits in a well-designed system. I reflected on the last 12 months, the blue lights on the lawn, the mechanical whine of the locksmith's drill, and the way the law had stood like a stone wall between me and the vultures. I remembered the cold weight of the quitclaim deed on my Thanksgiving table, and the metallic click of handcuffs closing around Emily's wrists. The house had been a battlefield, every room contested territory. But now, standing in the quiet aftermath, I realized the war was over. The house was no longer a museum of what I'd lost. It was a workshop for whatever I had left to build. I realized that while the Redmonds had tried to take my future, they had accidentally given me a new one, rooted in absolute autonomy. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for how I spent my days. The house was mine legally and spiritually, and that clarity was a gift I hadn't expected. I looked at the portrait of Maria on my desk. Her painted eyes seemed to watch me with a knowing patience, as if she had seen this moment coming 12 years ago, when she had signed the enhanced life estate deed. "I'm still here, Maria," I whispered, "and the roof doesn't leak." The presence of her wasn't a ghost to be defended anymore. It was the foundation I was standing on. I moved to the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the stack of 15 letters. I carried them into the kitchen, the smell of cedar and morning rain following me through the hall. I placed the stack in the center of the kitchen counter, right in the light of the bay window. The sunlight made the envelopes almost translucent, and I could see the shadow of handwriting through the paper. I still wasn't ready to break the seals, but by placing them there, I was acknowledging that the daughter who wrote them was trying to find her way home. It was a small act of mercy moving them from the dark drawer to the light. I poured a cup of coffee into Maria's favorite ceramic mug, the bitter hot liquid warming my throat in the quiet house. The mug was chipped at the rim, a casualty of decades of use, but I had never been able to throw it away. As I shifted the stack of letters, the final envelope, the one from the very top, slipped to the side. I glimpsed a bit of color through the translucent paper, a flash of crayon red and blue. I picked it up and carefully opened the seal. I realized then that the unopened letters were never just about Emily's needs. This last one wasn't a letter at all. It was a collection of drawings from Leo. I pulled out the sheets of construction paper, each one covered in the bold, unsteady lines of a child's hand. I saw a crayon sketch of the two of us standing in a garden where the roses were as big as the house, both of us holding hammers. It was a map of a future I hadn't dared to imagine. I stood in the morning light, the 15 letters waiting on the counter like seeds in winter, and I realized that while I couldn't control what grew back, I was finally ready to decide what was worth tending. The gold veins in the kintsugi plate seemed to glow as the sun rose higher, marking the beauty of the break. I picked up my mug and looked out at the Japanese maple, its leaves turning a vibrant, defiant red. Not today, I thought. looking at the letters, but maybe next year. I was 71 years old, my house was my own, and for the first time in my life, the silence was exactly what I wanted it to be. I took a slow sip of coffee and began to plan the repairs for the garden fence. There was work to be done, and I was the only one who needed to sign off on the design. Looking back, I understand now that my greatest mistake wasn't the legal trap or the silence at the table. It was believing that love alone could protect me. This family story taught me that boundaries are not betrayal, they are survival. If I could speak to the man I was before that Thanksgiving, I would tell him, don't wait for respect to disappear before you defend your dignity. Don't confuse patience with permission. What some may call dad revenge, I no longer see as revenge at all. This dad revenge was never about destroying my daughter. It was about refusing to let myself be erased. And in that sense, this dad revenge became something else entirely, a man choosing to stand when everything in his life was trying to push him down. Every family story has a moment where truth shows itself. Mine came too late, but not too late to save what mattered most, my peace. If you're listening to this family story, take it as a warning. Speak early, protect what you've built, and never let anyone, even your own blood, decide your worth for you. I believe God placed the right people in my path when I needed them, most reminding me that even when family fails you, you are never truly alone. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I'd truly like to hear from you. What would you do if you were in my position, facing that kind of betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Just a gentle note, while inspired by real-life themes, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling. And if this type of story isn't for you, feel free to explore other content that better fits your interests.